The Wind River Range carried a strange kind of silence in the early autumn of 1833, a silence that lived not in the absence of sound, but in the confidence of stone. Granite spires rose like old cathedral walls, cutting the sky into cold, sharp fragments of blue. Frost clung to the bunchgrass before the sun ever thought to lift its head over the ridges, and when it finally did, the light came thin and pale, like a lantern running low on oil. Up high, where only bighorn and the most stubborn trappers wandered, the wind had begun its winter rehearsals short, bitter gusts that tested every seam in a man's coat and every nerve in his resolve. It was into this raw country that Elias Boone Hardesty climbed with the deliberate pace of someone who understood mountains the way others understood Scripture. He was young by frontier standards, barely past 30, but already carved into lean, hard lines by years spent between traplines, Indian trails, and whatever lonely place his curiosity drove him. His father had been a hunter of the old Virginia breed, his mother a mapmaker from St. Louis who hand-drew every major river bend between the Missouri and the Platte. Elias seemed to stand somewhere between them, half wilderness and half ink. He carried a Hawkins rifle over his shoulder, but tucked beneath his coat was a wrapped parcel far stranger and infinitely more valuable than fur, a map older than any he had ever studied. The map had come into his possession the previous spring, though possession was hardly the right word. It had been placed in his hands by a dying Ute elder, skin cracked like sun-baked clay, breath rattling like autumn leaves. The man had spoken in fragmented English and Ute alike, using gestures when words failed. From what Elias could gather, the elder claimed the parchment had been drawn by survivors of a Spanish entrada, a wandering band that had come north nearly 150 years earlier, long before the EJF and Gators, arrival of American trappers, before the British traders, before even the oldest Crow stories spoke of white-skinned wanderers. The elder said the Spaniards had survived some great disaster in the mountains: avalanche, starvation, sickness. Only a few lived long enough to scratch their route. Landmarks, warnings, and a series of mysterious symbols onto a vellum stretched thin as onion skin. The Utes found them, buried them, and kept the map because the mountain wished it hidden. Why he had chosen Elias as the map's final keeper was a thing the young trapper still wrestled with. Perhaps the elder saw something in him. Perhaps he simply saw someone who cared more about truth than treasure. The trappers at Green River Rendezvous had certainly cared about neither. When Elias unrolled the fragile sheet beneath a patchwork of trader tents, the men laughed so hard their ribs ached. "Spanish gold again?" roared one Taos trapper. "Next you'll be saying Cortez himself rode through these peaks looking for silver." Another slapped Elias on the back. "Boy, if I had $1 for every Spaniard who died comin' north chasin' a ghost story, I'd rival Astor himself." But Elias didn't hear their jeers. He saw something else entirely: shapes, symbols, and contour lines that whispered truth in their crooked, faded strokes. He had spent nearly 10 years studying Jedediah Smith's journals, tracing the margins where Smith had scribbled half-forgotten landmarks and salvation-oriented notations. Water hole through narrow defile. Crow trails converge at Black Rock, pass near star-shaped ridge. These small observations, overlooked by most, were the road signs of a careful mind mapping places others feared to enter. Now, studying the Spanish map, Elias felt that same careful mind speak from across centuries. The peaks were drawn disproportionately large, just as Smith often did when trying to remember their silhouettes. The Crow, Buffalo corridors, arcs of migration that only Beckworth and a handful of Crow elders truly understood, were hinted at by looping marks that mirrored seasonal routes. Even the faint, serpentine line of what must have been an early Spanish trade road matched descriptions he'd read in Devoto's notes about the entrada routes north of Santa Fe. The more he examined it, the more undeniable it became. This was no campfire exaggeration, no whiskey-born legend. The map aligned with real geography, uncannily so. That realization carried him into the high-wind rivers, to a narrow, wind-gutted pass that no settler with sense would go near. The locals called it Fool's Draw, and they meant it unkindly. The pass funneled winter storms with a vicious efficiency, turning snow into roaring white avalanches and wind into something that felt alive in its malice. When Elias hauled in his first load of logs to begin building a cabin, he met nothing but laughter. "You plannin' to die in that pass?" asked a bearded Missourian leading a mule string. "Ain't no sane man winters up there." One of the settlers' wives, wrapped in a faded shawl, shook her head. "Storms slide off them peaks like wolves down a chute. They'll have that cabin torn off its own stumpin'." Another trader pointed and cackled. "Let him build. Ain't every day a man builds his own grave." But Elias only smiled and kept hauling timber. He wasn't building a monument for approval, he was building a station of inquiry, a place where he could spend months comparing the map's landmarks to the land itself. The cabin he raised wasn't pretty, just a tight, low structure of lodgepole pine, insulated with mud and spruce boughs, but it stood solid, anchored against the worst winds the mountains could conjure. Each evening he sat at his rough-hewn table, Spanish map spread before him, Smith's journal open at his elbow, Beckworth's recollections running through his mind. He traced, roots with a charcoal nub, piecing together the dead Spaniard's path like a man assembling a puzzle underwater. Something in those faded lines called to him something unfinished, something lost but not dead. He decided he would winter in Fool's Draw, studying the map until its secrets surfaced. On the last day of October, while he chopped kindling outside the cabin, the sky shifted. The wind died, as if inhaling. The peaks darkened not with dusk, but with a wall of rolling gray that swallowed their jagged crowns. Elias felt the hair on his arms rise. This was no ordinary storm. Every mountain instinct he possessed screamed a warning. Then it came, a roar like 1,000 hooves, shaking the earth. A rush of air colder than river ice, snow whipping from the sky in sideways spears. The first storm of the season, and far earlier than it had any right to be descended on Fool's Draw, with the ferocity of something ancient and intentional. Elias ducked inside the cabin as the wind slammed against it like a battering ram. He had the sudden, uncanny feeling that the mountains themselves were watching him, and that winter had only just begun to test his resolve. The storm that christened Fool's Draw did not end so much as it slowly lost the will to fight. By the morning of the third day, its fury had settled into a steady, drifting snowfall, quiet and deceptively gentle, like a tired predator conserving strength for another lunge. Elias Boone Hardesty stepped outside into a world-remade snow up to his knees, the pines bent beneath its weight, the cabin roof creaking like an old man waking from a stiff sleep. He tested the structure the way a blacksmith tests new iron, a deliberate tap here, a shoulder shove there, listening not for the sound, but for the feel. The cabin did not complain. The ridge truss roofing, borrowed from a crow design he'd studied 2 years earlier near the Bighorn, held under the load exactly as the crow elders said it would. Spruce, bindings tightened in the cold, strengthening the seams. Mud chinking froze solid, sealing out the wind better than any white man's cabin down in the basin. The settlers below had mocked him for using Indian tricks. But Indian tricks had saved more mountain men than rifles ever had. By the end of the week, the storm had swept down into the lower basin. Elias descended to trade for flour and lead shot, finding the settlement in miserable shape. Roofs had collapsed under the snow. Chicken coops lay scattered like spilled toys. A dozen men and women wore the bruises and frostbite that came from digging their families out in the dark. It didn't take long before they saw him. Hardesty. Jonas McCaffrey bellowed from the blacksmith shed where he was hammering at some half-frozen scrap of iron. Jonas was a wide-bodied Irishman with a laugh big enough to be heard across a creek and a temper that could melt snow. "Well, look at you. Not dead after all." A couple settlers chuckled as Elias approached. "Storm catch you halfway through building your coffin?" one asked. Elias shrugged. "Cabin standing." Jonas blinked. "Standing? Up in the draw?" Elias nodded. Jonas squinted at him as if trying to see whether frostbite had damaged his brain. "Boy, I don't know whether to call you lucky or liar." From inside the mercantile, a quiet voice drifted. "He's neither." Maya Running Fox stepped out, snow still clinging to her moccasins. Shoshone by birth and temperament, she moved with that particular mountain grace that made even trappers fall silent without knowing why. She carried a small satchel of beadwork, Spanish trade beads strung in patterns older than the United States itself. She studied Elias with a gaze as direct as an arrow. "You use crow roofing," she said. "Crow roofs do not fall." Elias smiled faintly. "So I've learned," Jonas snorted. "That so? Well, fool or prophet, you're the only one whose shack didn't get itself flattened. Maybe them crow tricks ain't so foolish after all." "Crow homes last because they listen to wind," Maya said. "White homes fight it. Wind always wins." The settlers laughed, though more gently this time. Inside the mercantile, Elias traded for flour, salt, and a few strips of dried apple. When he set the wrapped Spanish map on the counter to adjust his coat, Maya's eyes sharpened. She stepped closer. "What is that?" she asked. Elias hesitated. For months he had kept the map hidden, unrolled only in the privacy of his mountain cabin. But something in Maya's tone, curiosity, not greed, made him unwrap the vellum just enough for her to see the corner marked with strange looping symbols. Her breath caught. "I know that shape." "You do?" She pointed to a curved mark, ink faded but still visible. "That is a Spanish horse brand. I have seen it on beads carried by the Utes. Old women say they come from a time when Spaniards wandered north and did not return." Jonas leaned over their shoulders. "Tell me this ain't more gold nonsense." "It isn't gold nonsense," Elias said quietly. "This lines up with the Crow migration routes, and with Smith's own journal notes through the Wind Rivers. Somebody drew these landmarks from real ground." Jonas scratched his beard. "Even if it's real, what makes you think them Spaniards weren't just lost?" "They might have been," Elias said. "But lost men don't draw maps this careful. They mark water, minerals, hazards. They record the land the way a dying man records prayers." Maya traced another symbol lightly. "This marking means danger, mountain danger. Maybe snow, maybe stone." Elias folded the map carefully. "Exactly, which is why I need the winter. Storms force me to stay in the cabin. Give me months to compare this to every journal I own," Jonas snorted. "Winter's barely started, and already it's trying to kill us." "You stayin' up there through the whole of it? In Fool's Draw?" "I am." For the first time, Jonas didn't laugh. Before Elias left, Maya touched his arm. "Storms come early this year," she said. "My grandmother called winters like this the red wind. They break men who think they are stronger than mountains." "Good thing I don't think that," Elias replied. "I only think mountains tell the truth if a man listens long enough." Maya nodded slowly. "Then listen well." He returned to Fool's Draw at dusk, the sky bruised purple and the air sharp enough to crack pine. As he reached his cabin, a gust slammed into the pass with a howl that rose from the stones themselves. The mountains weren't finished with him. Winter had only begun to speak. By mid-November, the Wind River Range had buried itself beneath a depth of snow that belonged more to February than fall. The drifts in Fool's Draw reached a man's chest, some mornings wind-carved ridges that changed shape each hour, as if the mountains were breathing under a white hide. Elias Boone Hardesty learned quickly that winter here wasn't a season. It was a sovereign power, a living thing with moods and tempers and long silences that warned of coming violence. Inside his cabin, the walls groaned like the hull of a ship. Frozen spruce bindings creaked under strain. The ridge truss beam, his proudest engineering achievement, held stubbornly, but even it quivered when the wind raked over the roof in long, icy strokes. Elias woke each night to the sound of snow sliding down the pass in roaring sheets. Avalanches were common in Fool's Draw, and more than once he felt the earth shudder under him as tons of frozen debris thundered past. But the cabin endured. Each day he checked its seams the way a doctor checks a wounded patient. The mud chinking had hardened into stone. The spruce lashings tightened, sealing out drafts. The cabin stood where any other settler's home would have, splintered. He felt a quiet satisfaction, part pride, part gratitude, to the Crow elders whose designs had inspired the structure. Out here, Indian knowledge wasn't exotic, it was survival. Food was another matter. Supplies dwindled faster in the cold. Elias stretched every pound of flour with shredded jerky, every cup of beans with melted snow. He hunted when storms allowed snowshoe hare, the occasional ptarmigan, but game fled the high pass once winter sank its claws into the range. Some days he went hungry. Some nights he ignored the hunger to stay bent over the Spanish map, studying by tallow light. The map had become both puzzle and companion. He compared the symbols against Jedediah Smith's journals, tracing Smith's route through the Wind Rivers with his finger. He reread Beckworth's recollections of crow-hunting corridors. He spread NPS trade route sketches across the table, layering knowledge like skins on a frame. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The Spaniards hadn't followed the easiest trails. They had followed the oldest ones, the ones carved by buffalo centuries before men arrived. Buffalo trails never lied. They led to water, shelter, low passes, and mineral beds. Mineral beds? Elias paused each time he traced the Spanish symbol shaped like a crooked crescent. It wasn't a river. It wasn't a ridge. It might very well be a vein of volcanic rock, the kind that often held silver, or galena, the kind Spanish explorers would chase with the desperation of men who believed God himself hid treasure in the mountains. Some nights, when the fire cracked and the wind fell silent, Elias felt a strange pull in his ribs. A sense that he was walking in the footprints of men who had died trying to leave behind a record, men whose bones were likely under the very snow blanketing the peaks. On the 12th night of relentless storms, a faint knock sounded at the cabin door. Elias froze. No one should be able to reach Fool's Draw in such weather. He grabbed his rifle, cracked the door open, and found Maya running fox, half collapsed, snow crusted in her hair and lashes. Frostbite gnawed at her cheeks. She shivered so violently her teeth clicked like chattering stones. "Help, please," she whispered before her legs buckled. Elias dragged her inside, wrapped her in buffalo robes, and pressed warm ironstone near her hands. It took hours before Maya could speak clearly, and when she did, her voice was thin as wind through cottonwoods. 3 families below the basin. Roofs broke, too cold, they needed shelter. "You came alone through the pass?" Elias asked, incredulous. She nodded weakly. "I told them I would fetch you. You have the only warm place left." Her eyes fluttered. Storm changed, trails vanished, I lost my way. Elias felt a familiar pang duty wrapped in fear. Fool's Draw wasn't safe for travel in winter, but people were dying below. Settlers who had mocked him, yes, but now they were simply humans trying to survive the red wind winter. "I'll go at first light," Elias said. "I'll bring them here." Maya gripped his wrist. "They won't make it down there. They must come up." The idea chilled him more than the storm. Bringing families up the draw meant risking avalanche, whiteout, and death, but keeping them below meant certain freezing. He stoked the fire higher, heating the cabin until the air shimmered. Maya slept. Elias sat in the flicker of lantern light, staring at the Spanish map laid before him. The symbols seemed to shift in the golden glow veins, passes, warnings, echoes of the dead Spaniards. Echoes of winter. Winter that took, winter that tested. As dawn finally bled gray across the mountains, the storm eased to a steady whisper. Elias shouldered his pack, loaded spare blankets, and checked his rifle. Maya stirred. "You will bring them," she murmured. "I will," Elias said. He stepped outside. The silence was absolute, heavy, expectant, the kind that settles before a mountain decides whether to spare or swallow the men beneath it. Something deep in the draw groaned. Snow cracked in a long, low echo. Winter was far from finished. But Elias Boone Hardesty didn't turn back. He marched into the storm to gather the living because the fool's cabin was the only place left in the mountains where hope still had a roof. The first real cold came not with snow, but with a strange stillness, an eerie pause in the rhythms of the Wind River Range that set even the ravens watching in uneasy silence. Elias Boone Hardesty felt it before he saw it. The air sharpened, the frost growing thicker on the spruce needles, the creek beside his cabin turning glassy at the edges like a wound trying to seal. Old trappers had a name for winters like this, winters that came early and stayed late. Red wind winters, they called them. Winters that carried stories of buffalo dying by the hundreds, of men losing fingers by morning, of entire traplines vanishing under drifts so deep a man could walk across a whole ravine and never know it. By the middle of November, the red wind had begun its work. Storm after storm swept down the pass, each one carving deeper into the mountains, tearing snow loose from distant ridges and hurling it like white sand across Elias's cabin. The wind shrieked through Fool's Draw with a voice that felt almost human raw, angry, ancient. Elias braced beams where he could, checked his chinking and spruce bindings daily, and burned through his first store of firewood twice as fast as he'd planned. But the cabin held. It was a stubborn, low-built fortification, a marriage of Crow roofing principles and Elias's own structural instincts. The roof shed snow like a living thing, flexing, settling, tightening, and the walls breathed slowly in and out with each gust. After each storm, Elias stepped outside, expecting to find some new damage or failure. But the structure stood steady, its only complaint a faint groan from the ridgepole whenever the wind leaned too hard against it. Down in the basin, things were not so fortunate. On the 15th day of the month, the first group of settlers arrived, a man, his wife, and 2 half-frozen children. They knocked on his door, not with pride but desperation. Their roof had collapsed in the night, burying half their belongings and nearly crushing their mule. They had climbed toward the only place they thought might withstand the storm. Elias gave them fire, blankets, and what little spare jerky he had. The next day, 4 more settlers arrived, then 6. By the end of the week, 12 souls had taken shelter in the Fool's cabin, which now looked less like folly and more like sanctuary. Elias cleared space, built a second sleeping loft, and rationed supplies with a steady, cautious hand. The settlers spoke in anxious whispers at night. Horses froze in their stalls, one muttered. Old Trumbull tried to make for the fort. Never made it a mile. Snow up to the eaves. Never seen anything like it. The winter had not merely arrived, it had descended like a predator claiming the land. On the coldest of those nights, cold enough to make the logs crack like gunshots, there came a pounding at the cabin door. Elias opened it to find Maya running fox half collapsed against the frame, frost clinging to her hair, breath shallow. He pulled her inside without a word. Jonas McCaffrey, who was already helping Elias tend to the settlers, let out a low whistle. "By God, woman, you walked through that storm?" Maya nodded weakly. "The basin is worse than the pass. My aunt's lodge fell. I came because—" She hesitated, glancing toward Elias with a seriousness that cut through the cabin's dim lantern glow. "You came because of the map." Elias finished. She nodded again. When she had warmed enough to speak clearly, she pulled from her satchel a bundle wrapped carefully in buckskin. Inside lay a handful of beads, blue, red, and milky white, strung in patterns no Shoshone would ever use. "Spanish trade beads," she said. "My grandmother kept them. Old stories say they were given by wanderers who came north long ago, wanderers who carried metal tools, unlike any seen here." Elias handled the beads reverently. Some were unmistakably Venetian in origin, the kind Spaniards favored for trade deep in the continent. Others bore the faint scratches of age no frontier trader could replicate. They were older than any settlement in the basin. Maya pointed to one bead shaped like a teardrop. "This one matches the mark on your map. The Utes say the Spaniards carved that mark on trees, on stones, on the ground, near where they dug." Jonas's eyes widened. "So your map ain't just old stories and wishful thinking." "I never thought it was," Elias said softly. "But this is confirmation." The winter raged outside, but inside the cabin something shifted. Fear gave way to curiosity. Mockery gave way to belief. Jonas's loud humor softened into admiration. The settlers began looking at Elias not as the fool of Fool's Draw, but as the man whose shelter and stubbornness had kept them alive. And Elias, for the first time since the dying Ute elder placed the fragile vellum in his hands, felt the weight of purpose settle onto his shoulders. Not greed, not gold lust, but the sense that history real, breathing history, had chosen him as its interpreter. Night after night, while the settlers slept and the red wind screamed against the walls, Elias studied the map by lantern light. He cross-referenced every ridgeline with Smith's journals, every trail with Beckworth's recalled routes, every symbol with what Maya remembered from her grandmother's tales. And slowly, piece by piece, the map began to speak. The crooked line he once assumed was a river proved instead to be the course of an ancient glacial moraine. The arc of symbols along the upper corner matched perfectly with a Crow summer migratory corridor. A cluster of circles aligned with a known stretch of volcanic rock described faintly in NPS notations of early Spanish explorations. Elias leaned back in awe. "It's real," he whispered to the dim, flickering light. "Every inch of it is real." But outside the cabin, the wind rose again harder, colder, carrying the distant rumble of snow collapsing on the far ridges. A warning. Winter had not yet finished testing them. Winter was only gathering its strength. By mid-November of 1833, winter had sunk its teeth into the Wind River Range and refused to let go. The storm that had christened Fool's Draw turned out to be only the first warning strike. What followed was a cold so absolute it felt less like weather and more like a force of judgment, an old mountain spirit testing the worth of every human who had dared to build a fire beneath its shadow. Elias Boone Hardesty woke each morning to the same ritual: breathe into his hands until the numbness retreated, check the cabin seams for frost cracks, and clear the snow drifted against the door like a barricade. His breath hung in the air in pale ribbons as he shoveled, each motion carving a small circle of survival out of a white world intent on swallowing him whole. Yet despite the cold, the cabin held. The Crow Ridge truss roof tightened against the wind, just as Maya Running Fox had said it would. The Shoshone-style spruce bindings contracted in the deep freeze, sealing the edges where a white man's nails would have pulled loose. Each blizzard came roaring through the pass like an angry herd of buffalo, but the little lodgepole cabin endured, anchored into the mountainside like a stubborn thought. Down in the basin, however, life was breaking apart. News of the devastation reached Elias slowly. First came Jonas McCaffrey, trudging up the draw with one mitten missing and his beard frozen into a brittle white rake. Elias heard the knock and pulled him inside before the Irishman toppled face first into the snow. Jonas sank onto the floor, shivering uncontrollably. "Hardesty," he gasped, "you won't believe it. The storm, the second one, it wiped us clean. 2 cabins gone, chickens froze standing upright. Had to kill a mule that broke its leg in the drift." Elias poured him a tin cup of steaming spruce tea. "Drink. What about the McClarys?" Jonas's expression fell. "Roof collapsed. Wife broke her arm. They're squeezing into the mercantile with the others for now. But it ain't holding. Folks are talking, Hardesty. They're saying your cabin survived 2 storms straight. They're thinking maybe they ought to come up here." Elias blinked. "All of them?" "Aye. You should see it. Men who laughed at you are suddenly preying to the same Indian tricks they mocked." Elias looked at the cabin walls. They were strong, yes, but only built to shelter one man, not a settlement. If more storms hit, this place won't hold a dozen. Jonas shivered again, pulling his coat tighter. "Storms like this, they kill everything in their path. We got nowhere else to go." Elias said nothing for a long moment. The wind screeched outside, scraping along the ridge like claws on slate. "Bring them," he said finally. "But only the worst cases. Women, children, injured. We ration everything." Jonas nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "You're a good man, Elias." "Don't mistake desperation for goodness," Elias murmured. 3 days later, the first group arrived. A settler family of 4 parents, white-faced with cold, 2 children bundled in quilts, stiff with frost. Elias gave them space near the hearth, and a stew made of venison, dried apples, and a handful of precious flour. The children slept instantly, curled like pups. The next morning, a second group came 3 men, with frostbitten fingers, cheeks wind-burned to raw crimson. Behind them trudged Maya Running Fox, her braids frozen at the tips, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elias stood in the doorway as she approached. "You're hurt." She shook her head. "Not hurt, just cold." Her hands trembled slightly. "The people needed me to guide them." He stepped aside and ushered her in, helping her toward the hearth. She lowered herself beside the fire and breathed in the warmth with a soft, grateful sound. Maya looked at him after a long silence. The elders always said storms like these come after long seasons of pride. The mountains humble those who forget to listen. "I didn't forget," Elias said quietly. "No," she replied, watching him closely. "That is why you are still alive." As the settlers slept in huddled shapes across the cabin floor, Elias turned back to the Spanish map spread beneath the lamplight. His hands shook slightly, not from cold but from realization. For weeks he had studied the symbols without understanding their deeper meaning. He had assumed the looping lines marked rivers. The jagged strokes indicated ridgelines. The crescents showed campsites or mineral deposits. All logical, until now. Maya, warming her hands, glanced at the map. "That mark," she said softly, pointing to a curved crescent. "That is not river. It means thin snow. Weak snow, snow that falls from cliffs and kills." Elias froze. "An avalanche?" he asked. She nodded. "My tribe marks the same sign when telling winter stories." He felt the back of his neck prickle. The Spanish survivors had not been mapping simple geography, they had been mapping danger. They were warning anyone who followed their trail. The mountains punished those who misread them. Jonas leaned over the map. "You think the Spaniards died in one of those?" "Maybe," Elias murmured. "Maybe most of them." He traced the ink lines with one calloused finger. Suddenly the route made sense. The symbols weren't misaligned guesses. They were precise notes on where death waited. Avalanche chutes, unstable shale slopes, cliffs that shed ice without warning. The Spaniards had recorded everything they'd suffered, and the fact that this storm season matched their warning so perfectly sent a cold ripple down Elias's spine. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This wasn't a treasure map," he said. "It was a survival map." Maya nodded. "Sometimes the difference is the same." Another storm hit that night. The wind shook the cabin like a bear trying to tear into a meat cache. Snow thundered against the roof. The door bulged inward as drifts piled high, and the entire structure groaned from the pressure. Children woke crying. Jonas cursed. Elias stood with one hand pressed to the log seam, feeling the cabin's trembling heartbeat. But the ridge truss held, the bindings held, the walls held. Outside, the storm screamed until dawn. Inside, no one died. When the wind finally eased, Elias stepped into the white silence and looked toward the horizon. The Mexican vellum poking from his coat felt suddenly heavy with meaning. This winter was more than a season. It was the beginning of the trail the Spaniards had died marking, and Elias Boone Hardesty was now walking it whether he wished to or not. Below is the next chapter, Chapter 3, written into 900 words, continuing the same narrative voice, structure, and historical grounding. The second storm arrived before Elias had even finished cutting more firewood. It came down from the high peaks like a hunter with purpose, sweeping long white veils across the rocky crowns, swallowing the sky with a cold so sharp it felt personal. By mid-afternoon the temperature had fallen past anything sensible, and the sun, trapped behind a wall of cloud, bled out in a gray smear that made the entire world look like it had been dipped in ash. This was no ordinary frontier winter. This was the beginning of a season the old mountain tribes called the Red Wind a winter, remembered not for the color of snow, but for the color of men's faces when the wind scoured them raw. Inside the cabin, Elias fed the wood stove until it glowed like the heart of a forge. Flames licked the iron belly, pushing warmth across the small room, warmth earned, not given. Snow hammered the roof in a steady tattoo, the wind searching for any crack, any weakness. But the Crow ridge truss held fast, the spruce lashings tightened by the freezing air, and the mud chinking froze into something as tough as stone. Elias sat at the table, the map spread before him like a challenge. He studied it by the flickering light of a tallow candle, cross-referencing the faint lines with Smith's journals. Pass markings, water glyphs, volcanic rock shapes scribbled like jagged teeth. He ran a finger along a section that resembled a ridge he had seen only days earlier. They were here, he thought. The Spaniards really reached this far north. The wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Elias looked up, but it wasn't the storm. It was a knock, a frantic one. He opened the door to find two settlers from the basin below half, buried in snow, clinging to each other like men escaping a battlefield. Their faces were swollen with cold, one's ears already going black at the edges. They staggered inside before Elias could even speak, collapsing in a heap of soaked coats and frozen breath. "Storm came too fast," one gasped. Elias dragged them toward the stove, peeled off their wet mittens, and wrapped them in blankets. "What happened?" he asked. "Our roof caved," the older one said. "We went to the Smithson cabin. Theirs collapsed too. Wind tore it straight off." Elias nodded grimly. "Fool's Draw is the highest shelter for miles. Stay as long as you need." By morning, 3 more settlers had appeared, bruised and frostbitten. By the second morning, 5 more. Elias's cabin, mocked for months, now served as the basin's only fortress against the storm. He gave up his bunk to a mother and her child, slept on the floor, and boiled pot after pot of bone broth. The storms didn't break, they rotated, one retreating only long enough for the next to barrel down from the peaks. It was a war of attrition, and Elias's cabin was the last fort standing. One evening, as he split kindling outside, he spotted a lone figure staggering up the pass. Small frame, fur-lined moccasins, a braided plume of black hair stiff with frost. It was Maya Running Fox. She collapsed the moment she reached the cabin door. Elias caught her, dragging her inside, rubbing her hands until color returned. "You walked up the pass in this?" he said. "There was no choice," she whispered. "I brought something." From her satchel she withdrew a small wooden token, carved with the same symbol Elias had seen on the Spanish map. It looked like a slanted star crossed, with a half circle. "I found this in my grandmother's old things," Maya said. "She said it belonged to a Ute who once carried a map like yours." Elias stared at the token, his pulse quickening. "This confirms it," he murmured. "The Ute elder didn't invent the story. The Spaniards were here. Their survivors lived long enough to give the Utes more than just a map." Maya nodded. "The old stories say the Spaniards warned of a place where mountains kill without warning, a cursed canyon. They marked it with this." She tapped the symbol on the token. Elias's eyes moved to the vellum map on the table. There it was, the same symbol, drawn large over a narrow, twisting canyon deep in the Wind Rivers. The settlers watched from across the room, silent, no longer mocking him, no longer amused at the strange man with stranger papers. The winter had beaten the arrogance out of them. Elias, kneeling before the candle-lit map, became something different in their eyes. Not a fool, not a dreamer, a man following a trail older than memory. The storm outside roared again, battering the cabin walls. A gust slammed so hard that every man inside flinched, but the cabin held. Elias had expected this. He had prepared for it. Not through chance, but through skill, learned from tribes who understood mountains better than any settler ever would. That night, as the settlers slept in a disorganized tangle of blankets, Elias continued studying the map. His candle flickered against the parchment, bringing its symbols to life. Lines that once seemed meaningless now formed recognizable paths. The crow-hunting corridors, the ancient glacial scrapes along the ridges, the Spanish trade route detours that only experienced explorers would know. Then something clicked. Elias leaned forward. The river bend on the map wasn't a river, it was a lava flow, long cooled and shaped by centuries of erosion. The markings weren't tracking water, they were tracking volcanic rock. The Spaniards hadn't been searching for gold, they had been tracking silver-bearing ore. His breath caught. "The lost mines," he whispered. They weren't searching for legends, they were following geology. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin. Inside, Elias felt the shape of destiny shift. Winter was not just testing him. It was giving him time to uncover the truth buried beneath centuries of myth. The red wind howled on, but Elias Boone Hardesty was no longer just surviving it, he was deciphering it. By the first week of November, Fool's Draw had become a white throat, funneling winter straight out of the northern heavens. Every day, the mountains exhaled a wind that tasted of iron and old snow, a wind that clawed at Elias Boone Hardesty's cabin as if testing the seams of his resolve. Down in the basin, settlers named the early onslaught the Red Wind Winter, borrowing the same phrase Maya Running Fox's grandmother had used for storms that broke stronger men than Elias. But up here, in the narrow gut of the pass, the winter did not merely break men, it judged them. Most evenings, Elias sat at his pinewood table, firelight flickering across the Spanish map, and the journals he had spread open like a scholar barricading himself with books. Smith's careful scrawls, Beckworth's wild recollections, Schultz's tribal descriptions, Larpenteur's practical notes on surviving cold that turned breath into glass, Elias pored over them all. He compared ridgelines, migration patterns, rock formations, and half-forgotten Spanish trade tales told along the old Santa Fe Trail. Each night he found something new that wormed its way deeper into his thinking. A symbol on the map, resembling a spiral of thorns, matched Crow descriptions of a basalt butte near the upper Yellowstone. A set of small dots, once dismissed as ornamentation, perfectly paralleled Smith's record of a trail of 7 waterholes, each a day apart, if traveling light. A peculiar triangle shape, drawn with the precision of an engineer, aligned with a volcanic cleft that Devoto once wrote about, a black notch in the Wind Rivers, carved long before tribes knew the horses the Spaniards brought. The map was not fantasy, it was a record, a deliberate one. But the mountain gave him little time to celebrate his discoveries. With every passing day, storms slammed the pass with renewed fury. Elias often woke to the groan of snow sliding off the peak slow, grinding sounds that felt like the earth shifting in its sleep. He would step outside to find drifts taller than a buffalo bull and ice layering the cabin door like a second skin. Down in the basin, they were faring far worse. By mid-November, families from the settlement began trudging up the narrow trail toward Fool's Draw, cold-bitten, desperate, exhausted. Elias spotted the first group at dawn. 3 men, a woman, and 2 children, all wrapped in blankets crusted with snow. There, breath streamed in ragged, terrified clouds. He met them halfway down the trail. "Our roof fell," one man said, voice shaking. 2 of the others caved in too. "Jonah sent us. Said your place is the only one in the mountains that ain't trying to kill its owner." Elias nodded. "Come. Fire's warm inside." The cabin, cramped as it was, welcomed them like an old friend. Elias stoked the fire, melted snow into water, passed out strips of dried venison and biscuits he'd baked 2 days before. The children collapsed near the hearth, hands outstretched, eyes wide with gratitude only the half-frozen can muster. By the second week, there were 12 settlers in Fool's Draw. By the third, 19. The laughter that once greeted Elias at the mercantile had vanished. In its place came quiet respect and a dawning realization that the thin, dark-haired trapper might have understood something about surviving winter that most men never bothered to learn. Maya Running Fox arrived during the harshest storm yet, a storm that roared for nearly 37 hours without pause. When she stumbled through the drifting wall of snow at the edge of the cabin's lamplight, Elias nearly mistook her for a ghost. Her braids were rimed in frost, her gloves stiff with cold. She carried a satchel, clutching it to her chest as though it held her heartbeat. Elias caught her as she nearly collapsed. "You braved the pass in this weather?" Maya's lips trembled, but she managed a weak smile. "Storms come early, but stories come earlier. I found something for you." Inside the satchel lay 3 items, a string of glass trade beads, unmistakably Spanish in pattern, a small carved charm depicting a sunburst too detailed for Ute or Shoshone design, a scrap of old leather dyed the color of blood, marked with a faint brand identical to the one on the Spanish map. "I thought these might matter," Maya whispered. "My grandmother kept them hidden," said they, "belonged to a Spaniard who survived something dark in these mountains long ago." Elias's breath caught. The pieces were real, undeniably real. He held the sunburst charm near the firelight, watching how the flames illuminated the tiny carvings etched into its edges, carvings that matched the drawings on the map. "I knew it," he murmured. "The map is a route, a warning, maybe even a confession." Maya leaned closer. "The Spaniards almost never made it home. Those who did, they spoke of a place where the mountains swallowed men whole. Avalanche country, unstable volcanic ground, the exact sort of terrain Fool's Draw overlooked." Elias felt the cabin walls tighten around him, not in threat, more like a stage being set for a truth too heavy to stand in the open. That night, with Maya resting by the fire and the settlers sleeping like exhausted hounds, Elias traced the map again. Storm winds hammered the roof, but the crow truss held. Snow hissed against the logs, like whispered warnings. He could not shake the feeling that he was standing on the threshold of something ancient, and that the mountain itself knew he was getting closer. Outside, the storm lifted briefly. The sky above Fool's Draw opened just enough to reveal the jagged silhouettes of the peaks. They loomed like sentinels, silent and stern. Winter was not done. The red wind still had teeth. And Elias Boone Hardesty, map in hand, fire at his back, truth pulling at him like a river, felt in his bones that the worst was still coming.